Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 6, The Architect Phase. The shift from participant to designer. There is a moment that does not announce itself. No sound marks its arrival. No visible threshold is crossed. Yet something fundamental shifts beneath perception. The individual is no longer operating inside the system as a participant. They begin to see its contours from a distance that did not previously exist. This is not awareness in the conventional sense. It is not the accumulation of knowledge or the recognition of patterns already known. It is a structural repositioning of the mind itself. Before this moment, reality feels immersive, immediate, total. Every signal carries weight. Every event demands reaction. Attention is constantly pulled outward, distributed across surfaces that appear equally significant. But once the shift occurs, the surface begins to thin. Events lose their density. Urgency dissolves into pattern. What once felt chaotic reveals repetition. And repetition, when observed without distortion, exposes design. The architect phase begins here. Not when control is achieved, but when perception detaches from the illusion of immediacy. When the mind no longer confuses motion with meaning. Because most systems rely on participation to maintain themselves, they require attention. They require emotional investment. They require constant interaction to sustain the illusion of relevance. Remove those, and the system does not collapse. It reveals its structure. This is the first misunderstanding. People assume power comes from intervention, from acting, influencing, altering outcomes directly. But intervention is expensive. It consumes attention, energy, and time. It binds the operator back into the system's reactive loop. The architect does not intervene at the level of events. They redesign the conditions that produce them. This is a slower process, less visible, often mistaken for inaction. But it is the only level at which change becomes stable rather than temporary. To reach this state, the mind must tolerate a new form of distance, a distance from urgency, a distance from identity tied to reaction, a distance from the need to immediately resolve what is perceived. Because the instinct to react is the system's primary anchor. Break that, and the entire structure begins to loosen. This does not mean detachment in the emotional sense. It is not indifference. It is precision. The ability to observe without immediate participation, to measure without distortion, to allow patterns to fully reveal themselves before acting. Only then can the system be seen not as a sequence of events, but as a constructed environment. And once an environment is understood, it can be redesigned, not from within, but from above. Mapping the hidden variables. Once distance is established, a new problem emerges. Clarity does not immediately grant control. It exposes complexity. From within the system, behavior appears linear. Cause and effect seem directly connected. A decision leads to an outcome. An action produces a response. The chain feels simple, even when the results are unpredictable. But from above, the illusion of linearity collapses. What appears as a single action is rarely singular. It is the convergence point of multiple variables: timing, framing, emotional state, prior conditioning, environmental pressure, all interacting simultaneously. Remove one, and the outcome shifts. Adjust another, and the entire trajectory changes without any visible intervention. This is where most attempts at control fail, because they target visible actions instead of invisible variables. They attempt to force outcomes without understanding the field that generates them. They push against surfaces, unaware that the structure beneath remains unchanged. And when the structure remains unchanged, the system simply recalibrates, producing the same patterns in different forms. The architect does not focus on actions. They map variables, not just the obvious ones, but the silent parameters that shape behavior before it manifests. Variables that do not announce themselves. variables that operate continuously, unnoticed, yet determine the range of possible outcomes. Time is one of them. Not in its chronological sense, but in its positioning. When a signal is introduced, matters as much as the signal itself. The same idea, delivered at a different moment, produces entirely different effects. Context is another. No input exists in isolation. Every piece of information is interpreted through the surrounding environment. Alter the context, and the meaning shifts without altering the content. Expectation. One of the most powerful variables, because it preloads interpretation before perception even begins. People do not see what is there. They see what they are prepared to see. And preparation can be engineered. These variables are not independent. They interact, amplify, cancel, distort. They create a dynamic system where outcomes are not fixed but probabilistic, guided, not guaranteed. To map this system requires patience. Not passive observation, but precise tracking. Identifying which variables repeat, which remain stable, which fluctuate under pressure, which ones, when altered, produce disproportionate effects. These are leverage points. They are rarely obvious. They do not look like control. They look like subtle adjustments that cascade into systemic change. The architect does not seek to control everything. They identify what does not need to be controlled. Because in every system, most variables are noise, and a few determine everything. The task is not expansion of influence. It is compression. Reducing complexity to its critical points. Isolating the variables that define the system's behavior. And once isolated, understanding how minimal intervention can produce maximal transformation. This is where design begins, not through force, but through precision. Designing the conditions of emergence. Mapping variables is not the end of control. It is the threshold. Because knowing what shapes behavior does not yet allow you to shape it. It only reveals where influence can exist. The architect phase advances when mapping transforms into design, when variables are no longer observed, but arranged. This is where the distinction becomes absolute. Most attempts at influence operate through insertion. A message is introduced. A directive is given. A force is applied. These actions assume that behavior can be modified directly, that outcomes can be engineered by adding something into the system. But insertion is fragile. It competes with existing structures. It encounters resistance. It relies on attention, and attention is unstable. The moment attention shifts, the influence dissolves. Design operates differently. It does not insert. It configures. Instead of forcing behavior, it shapes the environment in which behavior emerges. And when the environment is correctly structured, behavior does not need to be directed. It unfolds as a natural consequence of the conditions present. This is the core principle of invisible leverage. Outcomes are not commanded. They are made inevitable. The system begins to move in a specific direction, not because it is told to, but because every available path subtly favors that direction. Alternatives exist, but they feel less efficient, less intuitive, less aligned with the perceived structure of reality. Choice remains, but it is weighted. This is the level at which resistance becomes irrelevant. Because resistance requires a clear point of opposition. It needs something to push against, a visible force, a defined constraint. But when influence is embedded into the environment itself, there is nothing to resist. The system feels neutral, even when it is not. To design at this level requires understanding sequence, not just which variables exist, but the order in which they activate. Because influence is not static, it unfolds across time. A single variable introduced too early destabilizes the system. Introduced too late, it becomes ineffective. Precision in timing transforms influence into inevitability. The architect does not move quickly. They move accurately. They allow the system to settle into a configuration where minimal input produces maximal directional shift. They remove friction where alignment is needed. They introduce subtle constraints where deviation becomes likely. And over time, the system reorganizes itself, not through force, but through coherence. This is why the most effective designs are rarely recognized as designs. They feel like reality. And when something feels like reality, it is no longer questioned. It is followed. The illusion of neutral systems. Once conditions are designed, a new layer of complexity appears. The system must not reveal that it has been shaped. Because the moment structure is perceived as intentional, resistance begins to form. Not always consciously, not always immediately. But the recognition of design introduces friction. It creates distance between the individual and the environment. And distance disrupts flow. So the most effective systems do not present themselves as constructed. They present themselves as neutral. Neutrality is not the absence of influence. It is the concealment of direction. A neutral system feels open, unbiased. It appears to offer equal access to all possible outcomes. It suggests that movement within it is self-determined, guided only by personal preference, logic, or instinct. But this perception is engineered, because true neutrality would require the absence of weighting. And in any structured environment, weighting is inevitable. Some paths will always be more accessible, more reinforced, more aligned with the system's internal logic. The architect does not eliminate weighting. They distribute it invisibly. This is done through subtle asymmetries. One path may require less effort. Another may provide slightly faster feedback. A third may align more closely with pre-existing expectations. None of these differences are strong enough to be noticed individually, but collectively, they shape movement with precision. Over time, patterns emerge. Not imposed patterns, chosen ones. At least, that is how they are experienced. This is the second fracture in the illusion of autonomy. Because when choices consistently lead in one direction without explicit instruction, the system appears self-organizing. It feels as if individuals are independently arriving at the same conclusions, moving toward the same outcomes by their own reasoning. But convergence is not coincidence. It is architecture. The system has been designed in such a way that deviation is possible, but statistically rare. And rarity, when observed repeatedly, begins to feel like error rather than alternative. This reinforces alignment, without force, without command, without visibility. The system becomes self-stabilizing. It no longer requires constant adjustment because the conditions that guide behavior are embedded at a foundational level. Feedback loops reinforce the dominant direction. Outliers are absorbed or corrected by the surrounding structure. And most importantly, the system maintains the appearance of freedom. Because control that feels like control invites rejection. But control that feels like choice becomes identity. And identity does not resist itself. This is the architect's advantage, not dominance, invisibility. Friction engineering. Every system moves, but not every system moves efficiently. What appears as randomness is often the result of unmanaged friction. Invisible resistance embedded within pathways, slowing movement, distorting direction, fragmenting coherence. Most participants never question it. They experience friction as natural, as part of reality itself. But friction is rarely accidental. It is placed. Not always deliberately in its origin, but always exploitable in its presence. Because wherever movement exists, resistance defines its shape. And whoever understands resistance controls the path of least effort. This is where the architect begins to refine control. Not by accelerating everything, but by deciding what should slow down. Friction is misunderstood as an obstacle, something to eliminate, something that blocks progress. But in structured systems, friction is guidance. It determines which actions feel heavy and which feel effortless. It subtly teaches the system where to go without ever issuing instruction. Humans follow ease, not consciously but consistently. They gravitate toward what requires less cognitive load, less emotional tension, less time to resolve. And over repeated exposure, ease becomes preference. Preference becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. This is the leverage. Because by engineering friction, the architect does not need to control desire. They shape its direction. A pathway filled with micro-resistance becomes unattractive, not because it is forbidden, but because it feels inefficient. A pathway with reduced resistance becomes dominant, not because it is superior, but because it feels natural. This is how systems steer behavior without visibility, not by telling people where to go, but by making certain directions feel better to move through. The precision lies in subtlety. Too much friction creates awareness. It triggers frustration. It exposes constraint. The system becomes visible, and once visible, it can be challenged. Too little friction removes structure. It creates chaos. Without resistance, movement loses direction, and coherence collapses. So the architect calibrates. They distribute resistance in gradients, small enough to remain unnoticed, consistent enough to shape behavior over time. This creates a field where movement appears free, but is constantly guided by invisible pressure. And over time, the system optimizes itself, because participants begin to internalize the paths of least resistance. They adapt. They align. They reinforce the very structure that guides them, without ever seeing it. This is the final layer of control at this stage. Not direction, but flow. Threshold control. Every system contains invisible gates, not barriers in the physical sense, but thresholds, precise points where continuation either feels natural or begins to collapse. These are not experienced as external constraints. They are felt internally, as hesitation, resistance, uncertainty, or a subtle loss of momentum. And this is where the illusion becomes most effective. Because when friction is internalized, the system disappears. Most individuals interpret these moments as personal limitations, a lack of discipline, a failure of will, a fluctuation in motivation. They do not recognize that the structure they are moving through has already defined where effort begins to feel excessive. But thresholds are not random. They are positioned with intent. A threshold determines the exact moment where the perceived cost of continuation outweighs its perceived value. And perception, unlike reality, can be engineered with extreme precision. This is where control becomes almost undetectable. Because the system does not block movement, it evaluates it, quietly, continuously. Every action passes through a layer of micro-assessment. Is this worth continuing? Is this becoming inefficient? Is there an alternative path that feels easier? And in most cases, these evaluations are not conscious. They occur beneath awareness, shaped by previous exposure, environmental cues, and subtle design choices embedded into the system itself. The architect understands that behavior is rarely decided at the point of initiation. It is decided at the point of strain. At the exact moment where continuation requires just slightly more than what feels natural. That slight increase is enough to redirect behavior entirely. Too small to notice, too consistent to escape. If the threshold is calibrated correctly, the system does not need to enforce compliance. It allows deviation, but makes it progressively less attractive. Not impossible. Not forbidden. Simply inefficient. And inefficiency, when repeated, becomes avoidance. This is how entire behavioral patterns are redirected without visible intervention. Not by controlling decisions directly, but by controlling where decisions begin to break. The precision lies in placement. If the threshold is too aggressive, it creates awareness. The individual recognizes resistance and begins to question it. The system becomes visible, and visibility introduces instability. If the threshold is too weak, it loses influence. Behavior becomes unpredictable, and the system loses directional control. So the architect refines. They test micro-adjustments. They observe where momentum slows, where it stops, where it redirects. Over time, they identify the exact points where minimal pressure produces maximal behavioral shift. These points are rare, but they define everything. Because once a threshold is properly positioned, it does not need to be reinforced constantly. It becomes self-sustaining. The individual adapts to it, internalizes it, and eventually aligns with it without conscious effort. And at that point, control no longer feels external. It feels like preference. It feels like logic. It feels like self-direction, which is why it is almost impossible to detect. Feedback loop construction. Once thresholds are positioned, the system gains direction. But direction alone is not enough. A system can move in a consistent direction and still degrade over time. It can lose efficiency, fragment under pressure, or gradually drift away from its intended structure. Direction creates movement. It does not guarantee stability. This is where the architect introduces feedback. Not the visible kind, not explicit rewards, punishments, or signals that can be consciously recognized and evaluated. Those belong to crude systems. They generate awareness, and awareness introduces friction. The architect uses silent feedback, feedback that is embedded directly into the environment, feedback that does not instruct behavior, but subtly confirms it. It does not tell the system what to do. It makes certain actions feel correct, coherent, or aligned, while leaving others slightly unresolved, inefficient, or incomplete. The difference is almost imperceptible, but over time, it becomes decisive. Because human behavior does not require strong reinforcement to stabilize, it requires consistency. Repeated exposure to small confirmations is enough to shape preference. Preference becomes pattern. Pattern becomes expectation. And expectation closes the loop. Every action within the system produces a response. Not always visible, but always present. A smoother transition. A reduction in friction. A slight acceleration of outcome. A subtle alignment between what is anticipated and what occurs. These micro-responses accumulate. They begin to form an internal map. The individual does not consciously analyze this map. They feel it. They develop an intuitive sense of which actions work and which do not. Not based on logic, but on repeated exposure to feedback that appears neutral, even natural. This is where the system begins to self-organize, because once behavior aligns with expectation, and expectation aligns with system design, external control becomes unnecessary. The system regulates itself through internalized feedback patterns. The architect is no longer guiding behavior. The system is. But what the system learns is not truth. It learns alignment. This distinction defines everything. Truth introduces instability. It invites questioning. It opens alternative interpretations. Alignment removes those variables. It compresses perception into a narrow band where outcomes feel predictable and coherent. And predictability creates comfort. Comfort creates repetition. Repetition reinforces structure. Over time, feedback loops begin to compound. Single interactions layer into sequences. Sequences form cycles. Cycles reinforce each other, increasing the system's internal gravity. What began as subtle confirmation becomes a powerful pull toward specific patterns of behavior. Deviation remains possible, but it becomes increasingly unlikely. Not because it is restricted, but because it feels inefficient, unclear, or misaligned with the established structure of the system. This is how the system protects itself. It does not reject deviation directly. It absorbs it, redirects it, or neutralizes it through surrounding feedback. Outliers are not eliminated, they are diluted, and the system remains stable, not through force, but through continuous reinforcement of its own internal logic. At this stage, Influence is no longer applied externally. It is embedded within the system's feedback architecture. And once embedded, it sustains itself, quietly, precisely, and without the need for constant intervention. Structural memory and persistence. A system that can guide behavior is not yet complete. A system that can stabilize behavior is still not complete, because guidance can fade and stability can fracture. Under pressure, even well-formed structures begin to loosen if they rely too heavily on active regulation. External conditions change. Inputs shift. Participants rotate. The environment introduces noise. And if the system's coherence depends on constant correction, then what appears powerful is only temporarily maintained. The architect understands this limit. Control that must be continuously reasserted is not mastery. It is dependency. At the highest level of design, the goal is no longer to push the system toward order. The goal is to build a structure that remembers its order even after disruption. A structure that can absorb interference, lose temporary form, and still return to its intended configuration without external rescue. This is where structural memory becomes decisive. Structural memory is not memory in the human sense. It is not recollection, narrative, or conscious retention. It does not exist as thought. It exists as embedded tendency, as pattern residue, as configuration pressure. It is the accumulation of prior shaping so deeply integrated into the system that future behavior begins to inherit past design automatically. A system with structural memory does not need to be reminded what it is. It reorganizes around what it has already become. This is the difference between temporary influence and persistent architecture. Temporary influence lives on the surface. It depends on repeated signaling, active feedback, visible maintenance. The moment the signals weaken, the effect decays. The system drifts. Old patterns return. Entropy reclaims the structure because nothing beneath the surface was truly altered. Persistent architecture works differently. It changes the recovery pattern of the system itself. This matters more than initial behavior, because almost any system can be forced into a desired state for a short period of time. Pressure, novelty, fear, urgency, reward. These can all create immediate compliance. But the true test of design begins after the pressure is removed. When the system is left alone, what does it return to? What shape does it seek when no one is guiding it? That answer reveals whether architecture exists or only control. The architect does not aim to freeze behavior in place. Frozen systems are brittle. They shatter under stress because they cannot adapt. Instead, the architect builds deep patterning, internal structural preferences that remain active even while the surface changes. This is how persistence is achieved, not by preventing movement, but by defining the basin into which movement returns. Every threshold previously positioned, every feedback loop previously embedded, every friction gradient previously calibrated contributes to this memory. None of those elements function in isolation anymore. They begin to reinforce one another across time. A decision made in one phase leaves traces that shape the next phase. A pattern repeated under one set of conditions becomes easier to repeat under another. The structure accumulates continuity. This continuity becomes invisible law. Participants may believe they are adapting freely to changing conditions, but the range of stable outcomes has already been narrowed by what the system remembers. Even disruption starts to serve the architecture, because recovery itself has been designed. That is the real pivot. The architect is no longer designing behavior alone. They are designing restabilization. This is a deeper form of power, because it extends beyond the present moment. It operates after interruption, after failure, after distortion. It defines not only how the system functions when aligned, but how it returns when misaligned. And return is everything. A weak system can perform well during ideal conditions. A powerful system reveals itself by how it behaves after damage. If the system collapses, then its coherence was superficial. If it survives but mutates unpredictably, then its architecture was incomplete. But if it absorbs shock, redistributes pressure, and gradually reconstructs its prior logic without instruction, then it has crossed into persistence. At that stage, the system no longer needs constant enforcement. It contains its own continuity. This is why the most advanced structures often appear almost organic. They seem alive, adaptive, self-correcting. They do not feel rigid because rigidity is not the goal. They feel inevitable. They bend without breaking. They adjust without surrendering form. And because they can recover naturally, observers mistake their persistence for something intrinsic rather than engineered. But persistence is never accidental. It is built through layered recurrence, through repeated pattern reinforcement across varying contexts, through the creation of structural residues that make certain reconstructions easier than others. Over time, the system begins to carry its design forward on its own. The architect can step back, not because control has ended, but because control has been transferred into the structure itself. At that point, the system no longer needs to be held together. It knows how to become itself again. And that is when architecture stops being influence. It becomes permanence. Designing for controlled deviation. A system that stabilizes itself is powerful. A system that persists across disruption is advanced. But a system that cannot tolerate deviation will eventually collapse under its own structure. Because no system operates in a vacuum. External conditions shift. Inputs fluctuate. Participants introduce variability that cannot be fully predicted or modeled in advance. And when these variations encounter a system that is optimized only for control, the result is not resistance, it is fracture. Most architectures fail at this exact point. They pursue precision, but eliminate elasticity. They compress outcomes into a narrow range of acceptable states and assume that predictability guarantees durability. But predictability without flexibility is only temporary coherence. It holds under ideal conditions, but it cannot survive pressure. The architect does not attempt to eliminate deviation. They define it. Deviation is not treated as error. It is treated as a managed force. Because deviation, when left unstructured, behaves like entropy. It spreads, compounds, and destabilizes the system from within. But when it is deliberately contained, it becomes a release mechanism, a way for the system to dissipate pressure without compromising its core architecture. This requires segmentation. Not all layers of a system carry equal weight. Some layers define identity. They hold the system's structural logic, its feedback architecture, its threshold positioning, its long-term continuity. These layers must remain stable because they determine what the system returns to after disruption. Other layers exist for expression. These are the visible surfaces, localized behaviors, minor variations, adaptive responses to immediate conditions. These layers can absorb deviation without threatening the system's foundation. The architect separates these layers with precision. They allow instability in one, while preserving rigidity in the other. This creates controlled asymmetry. From the outside, the system appears dynamic. It shows variation, flexibility, even unpredictability. Different inputs produce slightly different outcomes. Local behaviors shift, surface patterns evolve. But beneath that variation, the core remains fixed, unmoved, untouched. This is not openness, it is containment. Because deviation is not free to propagate, it is redirected. The architect designs channels where deviation can exist safely. These channels act as buffers, absorbing irregularities before they reach structural layers. They allow movement, but limit its impact. They permit variation, but constrain its influence. Without these channels, deviation accumulates, and accumulation creates pressure. Pressure, when unregulated, searches for release, and when it finds none, It breaks the system at its weakest point. But when deviation is distributed across controlled zones, pressure dissipates gradually. No single point carries enough force to destabilize the structure. The system absorbs variation instead of resisting it. This is how resilience is engineered, not by removing chaos, but by allocating it. The difficulty lies in calibration. If the system allows too much deviation, containment fails. Variation spreads into structural layers. Feedback loops begin to distort. Thresholds lose their precision. Over time, the system drifts away from its intended configuration. It does not collapse immediately. It dissolves. If the system allows too little deviation, pressure builds invisibly. Participants experience increasing friction without release. Movement becomes constrained. Adaptation slows. The system appears stable, but internally it becomes dense and brittle. When deviation finally occurs, it does not disperse. It concentrates. And concentrated deviation is destructive. So the architect defines limits, not visible limits, functional limits. How far deviation can extend, how long it can persist, how much energy it can carry before it is redirected or absorbed back into the system's dominant structure. These limits are embedded into the system's pathways, not as barriers, but as gradients. Deviation becomes less efficient as it moves away from controlled zones. It loses momentum. It encounters subtle resistance. Eventually, it returns to alignment, not because it is forced, but because it becomes the path of least friction. This is the key transformation. Deviation is no longer opposition. It becomes part of the system's internal regulation. Participants believe they are exploring alternatives, expressing variation, adapting freely. And in a limited sense, they are. But the system has already defined the boundaries of that freedom. And more importantly, it has defined the return path. This is what prevents collapse. Because no matter how far variation extends within its allowed range, it is always guided back into structural coherence. The system bends, but it does not break. It absorbs disruption, but it does not lose identity. At this stage, resilience is no longer reactive. It is pre-designed. The system does not respond to deviation. It anticipates it. And by anticipating it, it integrates it into its own architecture. This is where control becomes indistinguishable from adaptation, where flexibility is not a weakness, but a controlled function, and where deviation, instead of threatening the system, becomes one of the mechanisms that sustain it. Energy distribution and invisible hierarchies. Every system moves through energy, not metaphorically, not symbolically. In practical terms, energy is the distribution of attention, time, cognition, emotional investment, access, friction tolerance, and interpretive bandwidth. These are the hidden currencies beneath all visible structure. They determine what receives reinforcement, what gains momentum, what becomes central, and what slowly fades into irrelevance. Most people think systems are governed by rules. They are not. Rules describe the visible boundaries of behavior, but they do not explain why certain pathways become dominant while others remain unused. They do not explain why some ideas scale while others disappear. They do not explain why some actors seem to shape outcomes far beyond their visible authority. That is because systems are not ultimately governed by rules. They are governed by distribution. Where energy collects, structure forms. Where structure forms, hierarchy emerges. And where hierarchy emerges without being named, power becomes difficult to detect. This is where the architect operates, not by declaring control points, but by shaping the conditions through which energy moves. Because hierarchy does not need to be announced to become real. It only needs repeated asymmetry, a slight bias in attention, a small difference in access, a minor advantage in speed, visibility, feedback, or coherence. Repeated long enough, these become architecture. This is the first principle of hidden hierarchy: concentration. No effective system distributes energy evenly. Equal distribution appears fair, but in practice, it creates weak centers, diffuse attention, and structural indecision. Nothing becomes dominant enough to organize the rest. Movement exists, but it lacks direction. The system generates activity without producing real form. The architect avoids this. They create zones of concentration. Specific nodes, pathways, symbols, or interpretive centers are given higher energetic density. More attention passes through them. More decisions reference them. More feedback loops stabilize around them. Over time, these zones begin to function as anchors inside the system. Not always visible anchors, but operational ones. They become places where meaning gathers faster, where decisions seem more efficient, where alignment is easier to maintain. Participants are drawn toward them not because they are commanded to, but because energy has already made them structurally important. This is how hierarchy begins, not through declaration, through accumulated flow. The second principle is scarcity. A hierarchy cannot form if every node receives equal reinforcement. Some pathways must be underpowered. Some must remain slightly slower, more fragmented, less rewarding, less coherent. Not enough to seem blocked. That would create awareness, but enough to prevent them from competing with the dominant structures. This is precision starvation. The architect does not destroy alternatives. They weaken their energetic viability. An underfed pathway may remain visible, but it will not scale. It will fail to gather sufficient momentum. Participants may pass through it, but they will not remain there long. Its outcomes will feel thinner, less stable, less compelling. Gradually, it becomes background. This is critical, because visible suppression creates resistance. Energetic underinvestment creates disappearance. One is confrontation, the other is silent erosion. The third principle is circulation. Concentration without circulation creates overload. When too much energy gathers in one region without controlled release, the system begins to distort. Central nodes become unstable. Feedback loops intensify beyond useful limits. What once acted as an anchor becomes a pressure point. So the architect designs movement cycles. Energy is not merely gathered, it is routed. It enters concentrated areas, is amplified through high-density interaction, then redistributed into secondary pathways that support the broader system without weakening the center. This creates layered hierarchy rather than brittle centralization. The strongest systems do not rely on one center. They rely on nested centers. Primary nodes shape the direction of the whole. Secondary nodes stabilize regional flow. Peripheral nodes absorb excess variation. Together, they create a hierarchy that feels natural because it behaves like a living distribution pattern rather than a rigid chain of command. This is the fourth principle, invisibility through function. When hierarchy is expressed through titles, declarations, or explicit rules, it becomes contestable. People can point to it, measure it, resist it. But when hierarchy is embedded in energy distribution, it becomes harder to name. It looks like relevance. It looks like efficiency. It looks like people or ideas naturally rising because they carry more weight. But weight was assigned long before it appeared earned. This is why invisible hierarchies are so stable. They do not tell the system what matters. They make certain things matter more often, and frequency becomes reality. The more attention a node receives, the more it shapes future attention. The more a pathway is used, the more coherent it becomes. The more coherence it gains, the more natural it feels. This creates recursive advantage. High-energy zones attract even more energy because their existing density makes them easier to choose, easier to trust, easier to build upon. Meanwhile, low-energy zones fade not because they are prohibited, but because they become increasingly difficult to justify. This is how hierarchy self-reinforces. And once self-reinforcement begins, maintenance becomes minimal. The architect is no longer forcing structure. They are preserving the distribution patterns that allow structure to regenerate automatically. That is the deeper point. Hierarchy itself is not the final object of control. Distribution is. Because hierarchy is only the frozen image of a deeper process. What appears fixed is actually the temporary expression of ongoing energetic flow. Change the flow, and hierarchy changes. Preserve the flow, and hierarchy persists even when surfaces shift. This is why advanced systems seem stable, even during visible transformation. New actors appear, symbols change, language evolves, interfaces are redesigned. Yet the underlying hierarchy remains intact because the distribution logic beneath it has not moved. The architect sees this clearly. They do not confuse visible power with actual leverage. Visible power is often just the front-facing consequence of where energy has already been directed. Real leverage exists earlier, deeper, at the level where attention is routed, where access is weighted, where cognitive effort is either reduced or increased, where emotional charge is either concentrated or dissipated. Control that operates there does not need to announce itself. It only needs to persist. And when energy distribution is shaped with enough precision, the system begins to generate its own hierarchy without command, its own gravity without force, and its own centers of influence without ever naming them. That is when architecture becomes dominant, not because it is seen, but because everything inside the system begins to move according to patterns it did not consciously choose. Latency is control. Speed is never neutral. At the surface level, it appears as efficiency. Faster responses, immediate feedback, seamless interaction. Systems that reduce delay are perceived as superior because they align with human preference for continuity. Immediate outcomes feel correct. They confirm expectation without interruption. They eliminate uncertainty before it can form. But this perception is incomplete, because at the architectural level, speed is not performance, it is control. Latency, the presence, absence, and distribution of delay, is one of the most precise variables available to the architect. Not because it changes what happens, but because it reshapes how events are interpreted, how meaning is constructed, and how behavior stabilizes over time. Every system operates within time, but not every system controls it. Most systems inherit timing passively. Responses occur as a byproduct of structure. Delays are treated as inefficiencies. Acceleration is pursued as optimization. But when timing is left unstructured, it produces inconsistency, and inconsistency introduces instability. The architect does not eliminate latency, they design it, because latency defines the space between expectation and outcome. And in that space, perception is formed. An immediate response closes that space. There is no gap for reinterpretation. The system appears smooth, aligned, self-consistent. Actions feel validated instantly. Decisions seem correct because they are confirmed without delay. This creates behavioral continuity. But continuity alone does not produce control. It produces flow. And flow, without variation, becomes indistinguishable. So latency must be distributed. This is the first structural layer, controlled immediacy. Certain pathways are engineered to resolve with minimal delay. These pathways become anchors of reliability. They feel efficient, predictable, stable. Participants begin to trust them, not through analysis, but through repeated temporal alignment. Trust at this level is not logical, it is rhythmic. The system trains expectation through timing. But immediacy cannot be universal. If every interaction resolves instantly, differentiation collapses. All signals carry equal weight. Nothing stands out. Nothing attracts sustained attention. The system becomes flat. So the architect introduces contrast. This is the second layer, differential latency. Not all pathways move at the same speed. Some accelerate, others slow. Others delay just enough to create subtle misalignment. These differences are rarely noticed consciously, but they accumulate. Faster pathways feel smoother, more natural, more aligned with the system's internal logic. Slower pathways begin to feel heavier, less efficient, slightly off. No rule is stated. No restriction is imposed. But preference begins to form. Participants believe they are evaluating value, but they are following time. This is where direction emerges, because repeated exposure to differential latency reshapes behavioral pathways. Faster options are selected more often. Slower ones are abandoned gradually. Over time, the system reorganizes itself around speed without ever declaring hierarchy. Timing creates gravity. The third layer is strategic delay. Delay is not always a weakness. When placed precisely, it becomes amplification. A delayed response creates tension. It forces attention to remain active. It introduces anticipation. It increases perceived importance by withholding resolution. The longer the delay, within controlled limits, the greater the potential reinforcement when resolution finally arrives. This is controlled tension. And tension, when resolved, produces deeper imprint than continuous flow. The architect uses this sparingly. Too much delay fractures coherence. It creates frustration, disengagement, unpredictability. But precise delay, applied at key structural points, reshapes perception without exposing design. Because the system does not appear slow, it appears meaningful. This is the critical shift. Latency is no longer experienced as inefficiency. It becomes significance. The fourth layer is rhythmic integration. At this stage, timing stops functioning as isolated adjustments and begins to form a pattern. The system develops cadence, a sequence of accelerations, delays, and resolutions that repeat with variation, but maintain internal consistency. Participants adapt to this rhythm, not consciously, but behaviorally. They begin to anticipate when responses will arrive, when delays will occur, when resolution will be given. Their actions start to align with this temporal structure. They move in sync with the system without needing instruction. This is synchronization. And synchronization is more stable than enforcement. Because enforcement creates resistance, synchronization creates alignment. Once aligned, behavior sustains itself. The architect no longer needs to manage individual interactions. They have defined tempo. And tempo governs behavior at a deeper level than rules or structure. Because rules can be questioned, structure can be analyzed, but rhythm is followed. It operates beneath conscious evaluation. It becomes internal. At this point, time itself becomes the medium of control. Not visible, not declared, but embedded into every interaction. Every response, every delay, every transition reinforces the same underlying cadence. And once that cadence is internalized, the system operates with minimal friction. Participants no longer react to the system. They move with it. And when movement aligns with time, control becomes invisible. Because nothing appears forced. Everything appears natural. This is the final state of latency as control, where speed is no longer about efficiency, but about shaping perception, stabilizing behavior, and embedding influence into the temporal fabric of the system itself. The point where systems become reality. At the end of the architect phase, there is no visible transition, no signal that something has been completed, no moment that marks the shift from design to dominance. Because the final state of architecture does not present itself as control. It presents itself as reality. Up to this point, the system has been constructed through layers, variables mapped, conditions arranged, friction calibrated, thresholds positioned, feedback loops embedded, memory stabilized, deviation contained, energy distributed, latency synchronized. Each layer reduced uncertainty. Each layer increased alignment. Each layer removed the need for direct intervention. But all of these layers still belong to construction. Closure begins when construction disappears, not in function, in perception. Because a system is only recognized as a system when its mechanisms remain visible, when its logic can still be traced, when its structure can still be questioned or compared against alternatives. As long as those conditions exist, the system remains external, and anything external can be resisted. So the final step is not reinforcement, it is dissolution. The system does not become stronger, it becomes unnoticeable. At this stage, all mechanisms merge into a single continuous field. Thresholds are no longer experienced as constraints. They feel like preference. Friction is no longer experienced as resistance. It feels like natural difficulty. Feedback is no longer recognized as reinforcement. It feels like truth. Latency is no longer perceived as timing control. It feels like normal sequence. And energy distribution is no longer seen as hierarchy. It feels like relevance. This is the transformation, from structure to perception. Because once perception aligns with architecture, control no longer needs to be applied. It is assumed. And assumption is the most stable form of control. Participants do not question what they assume. They operate within it. They build on it. They reinforce it through every action they take. This is where the system becomes self-contained, not only self-sustaining, but self-validating. Every decision confirms the system's logic. Every outcome reinforces its pathways. Every interaction strengthens the structure without requiring any visible mechanism to maintain it. There is no external reference point, no stable comparison, no alternative frame strong enough to destabilize perception from within. This is total integration. The system is no longer something that is interacted with. It is something that is inhabited. And when a system becomes the environment, its influence reaches its most efficient form. Because environments do not instruct behavior. They define what behavior feels possible. This is the endpoint of architectural control. Not force, not visibility, but inevitability. Because once a system defines perception, behavior follows without resistance. No instruction is required. No correction is necessary. The system no longer needs to guide. It only needs to exist. At this point, the architect disappears from the surface, not because they are gone, but because their presence is no longer required. The system carries its own logic forward. It reproduces alignment continuously. It absorbs variation without losing coherence. It maintains direction without applying pressure. It becomes reality. But no system exists without consequence. The moment a system becomes indistinguishable from reality, it stops competing at the level of perception and begins competing at the level of existence. Because integration creates pressure, not inside the system, outside it. Every closed structure reshapes the environment around it. It redirects attention, redistributes energy, alters the conditions in which other systems operate. And those systems do not remain passive. They adapt, they probe, they test. Not through direct confrontation at first, but through subtle disturbance, slight inconsistencies, minor disruptions, signals that do not align perfectly with the established structure. At first, these disturbances appear insignificant, noise, but they are not random. They are pressure. Because once a system becomes stable enough to sustain itself, it becomes visible to other systems operating at the same level. Not visible in form, but in effect. And effect attracts interference. This is the shift. Up to this point, architecture has been internal, designed in isolation, refined within its own boundaries. Now, it enters a field, a space where multiple systems coexist, overlap, and compete, each with its own logic, each with its own distribution, each exerting pressure on the others. And pressure changes everything. Because a system that only functions under controlled conditions is not complete. It is untested. Real architecture is not defined by how it performs in stability. It is defined by how it responds under stress. This is where the next phase begins. Not construction, not refinement, but resistance. Because once systems become reality, they begin to push against each other. Thank you for watching till the end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the following chapters and episodes.